When you picture Imperial China, your mind likely jumps to magnificent grand palaces, vast armies marching across silk routes, and brilliant scholar bureaucrats writing poetry with horsehair brushes. And if castrated men enter the picture at all, popular culture usually paints them as tragic side characters, whispering villains in silk robes, scheming in dark palace corridors, or miserable servants carrying tea trays for the royal family. But that popular image misses the most fascinating, counterintuitive truth of Eastern political history. Eunuchs were not an unfortunate side effect of royal excess. They were not a bug in the administrative software. They were a feature. For nearly 2 millennia, castrated men operated as one of the most powerful executive shadow networks in human history. At various points across dynasties, they commanded imperial armies, ran global intelligence networks, controlled the tax revenues of millions, and held the absolute power to elevate or liquidate emperors. To understand how men stripped of their manhood came to hold the ultimate levers of an empire, we have to look past the palace gossip and examine the cold, brutal logic of institutional survival. To understand why the eunuch system existed, you first have to appreciate the terrifying loneliness of being a Chinese emperor. Imagine you are a newly crowned emperor sitting on the dragon throne. On paper, you hold the mandate of heaven. You possess absolute authority over a territory larger than Western Europe, populated by tens of millions of subjects. But in reality, you are just one human being sitting in a room. You cannot collect taxes yourself. You cannot inspect distant borders yourself. You must delegate power. So, who do you hire to run your empire? Naturally, you look to the elite class, the nobility and the highly educated scholar bureaucrats. But here lies the ultimate trap, a structural crisis known in political science as the principal agent problem. To visualize this, imagine running a global mega-corporation where every regional vice president belongs to a powerful hereditary union. These VPs are wealthy, deeply entrenched in their local communities, and possess private networks of influence. Every time you give them more power, they don't just use it to make your company profitable. They use it to build wealth for their own children and extended families. Eventually, one of these regional VPs becomes powerful enough to launch a hostile takeover, remove you as CEO, and crown their own son as the new head of the company. In Imperial China, this wasn't a hypothetical fear. It was a repeating historical nightmare. Prime ministers, warlords, and aristocratic families routinely overthrew dynasties to establish their own bloodlines. The emperor needed executives who were entirely dependent on him. He needed people who had no noble family ties to enrich, no local military networks to lean on, and most importantly, no biological children who could inherit power and start a rival dynasty. Castration was the ultimate horrific corporate non-compete clause. By removing a man's physical ability to create a hereditary lineage, the state attempted to sever his connection to the future. A eunuch could accumulate wealth, but he could never pass a dynastic title to his biological son. His entire social existence, his safety, and his authority began and ended with the personal favor of the emperor. To see how this worked in practice, we have to examine the hidden architecture of the imperial state. Now, it is a widely accepted historical fact that the Chinese administrative structure was strictly divided into 2 distinct worlds: the civil service bureaucracy, known as the outer court, and the personal imperial household, known as the inner court. But modern institutional historians view this arrangement not merely as a moral struggle between virtuous scholars and corrupt eunuchs, but as a deliberate checks and balances system engineered by monarchs to prevent bureaucratic takeover. The outer court was run by civil servants, the mandarins. These were men who spent decades studying Confucian classics to pass the notoriously difficult imperial examinations. They believed in law, precedent, traditional morality, and administrative procedure. They saw themselves as the moral guardians of the realm. The inner court was the private domain of the emperor, his family, his concubines, and the thousands of eunuchs who managed the physical operations of the palace. Because Confucian ethics strictly forbade unrelated men from entering the private living quarters of the emperor's female household, eunuchs were the only adult males allowed inside the inner court after dark. This gave them an asset more valuable than armies or gold: unfiltered physical proximity. While scholar officials had to submit written petitions through endless bureaucratic channels, wait days for a response, and speak to the emperor only during formal morning audiences surrounded by witnesses, a high-ranking eunuch stood by the emperor's bed when he woke up. He served his meals, poured his wine, and carried messages between the sovereign and his ministers. Over time, smart emperors realized they could use this physical proximity to bypass the sluggish, stubborn civil bureaucracy altogether. If the scholars in the outer court refused to approve an emperor's policy or tax hike on moral grounds, the emperor didn't argue. He simply created a shadow administration inside the inner court. He instructed his trusted eunuchs to read the state memorials, draft imperial decrees, and execute secret orders. By the middle period of imperial history, eunuchs were no longer just domestic servants cleaning palace floors. They were running secret police organizations, directing state monopolies, managing foreign trade, and supervising military operations. They became the ultimate administrative backdoor. The role of eunuchs didn't remain static. It evolved across centuries, mirroring the rise and fall of China's major dynasties. In the Han Dynasty, eunuchs began as modest palace attendants. However, as infant emperors frequently inherited the throne, real power fell to the mothers, the empress dowagers, and their male relatives. Desperate to reclaim authority once they grew up, young emperors turned to the only men they could trust inside the palace, their childhood eunuch caretakers. Together they staged bloody palace coups, wiping out powerful aristocratic clans. In gratitude, emperors showered eunuchs with unprecedented political power and titles. By the Tang Dynasty, the balance of power shifted dramatically. During periods of severe political instability, eunuchs gained direct command of the Shenzhen army, the elite imperial guard protecting the capital. Once eunuchs commanded physical weapons, the dynamic inverted. They were no longer servants to the throne. They were kingmakers. During the late Tang era, eunuchs routinely assassinated emperors who disobeyed them and selected compliant successors from among the royal princes. The absolute peak of institutionalized eunuch power arrived during the Ming Dynasty. The founding Ming emperors initially tried to ban eunuchs from learning to read or meddling in state affairs, setting up iron tablets in the palace warning against their interference. But subsequent emperors, overwhelmed by the crushing workload of managing a massive country, reversed these rules. They established formal schools inside the palace specifically to educate eunuchs in literacy and statecraft. Soon, the Ming created the Eastern Depot, one of the world's first state-sponsored secret police and intelligence agencies, run entirely by high-ranking eunuchs. This organization operated outside standard judicial laws, possessing its own prisons, interrogation centers, and spy networks that monitored civil officials, military generals, and common citizens alike. It was also during the Ming Dynasty that a Muslim eunuch named Zheng He was placed in command of colossal treasure fleets, leading naval expeditions across the Indian Ocean decades before European voyages of discovery. By the time the final dynasty, the Qing, came to power, the rulers had studied the mistakes of the past. They implemented strict legal boundaries to curb eunuch authority, capping their numbers and banning them from military commands. Yet, even in the twilight of imperial rule in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, individual eunuchs like Li Lianying possessed immense influence due to their close relationships with figures like Empress Dowager Cixi. When we step back from the grand political chess game, what did this system actually mean for regular people living outside the palace walls? The real-world impact was felt first in the terrifying human supply chain required to feed the system. While some eunuchs were prisoners of war or criminals forcibly castrated as punishment, a vast number were young boys from impoverished rural families. Driven by extreme poverty, crop failures, and desperate economic conditions, parents subjected their young sons to primitive surgical procedures without anesthesia, gambling that the physical sacrifice might allow the boy to survive, enter the palace, and send money back home. In periods of economic distress, thousands of men voluntarily underwent self-castration in hopes of securing a stable government job inside the imperial household, leading to desperate crowds waiting outside palace gates, far more applicants than the palace could ever employ. On an administrative level, the constant ideological warfare between scholar officials and eunuch factions often crippled effective governance. When eunuchs controlled the imperial treasury, they frequently diverted state resources to fund lavish palace construction, monument projects, or personal estates. To cover these costs, regional officials squeezed peasant populations with heavy surcharges. When administrative rivalries paralyzed the capital, critical public works, such as maintaining canal dikes, storing grain for famine relief, and paying frontier border troops, were neglected. Time and again, when grain stores ran dry and defense systems failed, localized peasant revolts erupted, ultimately snowballing into the catastrophic rebellions that brought down dynasties. It is easy to look at this history and conclude that eunuchs were purely evil, corrupt parasites who destroyed every empire they touched. But modern historical analysis presents a far more complex, balanced picture. First, we must acknowledge a massive historical bias. Who wrote the history books? The historical records of Imperial China were written almost exclusively by Confucian scholar bureaucrats, the direct political rivals of the eunuchs. To the Confucian scholars, the civil service exam was a sacred meritocracy based on moral wisdom and classic literature. They viewed eunuchs as uneducated, unprincipled opportunists who bypassed the hard work of examinations simply by gaining the personal affection of the emperor. Naturally, scholar historians painted eunuchs in the worst possible light, blaming them for political collapses while downplaying the deep corruption within their own scholar ranks. Second, from an institutional standpoint, eunuchs often performed vital functions that saved empires from aristocratic stagnation. Scholar bureaucrats frequently formed powerful local landed cartels, protecting wealthy tax evaders in their home provinces and blocking necessary economic reforms. Because eunuchs had no local landowning ties, emperors could use them to enforce centralized policies, collect taxes from rebellious regions, and streamline emergency logistics. Without the administrative agility of eunuch networks, many emperors would have been completely imprisoned by the rigid, slow-moving orthodox bureaucracy of the outer court. The story of Imperial China's eunuchs isn't just a bizarre historical anomaly from a bygone era. It is a striking case study in human institutional design. It shows what happens when an ultimate central authority prioritizes total personal loyalty over institutional checks and balances, creating an informal shadow system to bypass formal rules. When systems prioritize absolute loyalty over transparent procedures, do they inevitably create shadow networks to exercise real power? And where do you see modern versions of this political logic playing out in corporate or government structures today?